Uh-oh. Okay, we'll start with this. We now know a lot more about Stephanie Hahn's next fight. Stephanie Hahn, unbeaten up-and-comer from right here in the U.S. of A. from El Paso, Texas. That's where the fight is going down, in her hometown. Scheduled for 10 rounds in the women's lightweight division for what is the newly vacated WBA title. That's right. The next WBA champion will be crowned when Stephanie Hahn takes on Hannah Terlep. Both 34 years old, Stephanie Hahn and Hannah Terlep, both orthodox fighters. Stephanie sports an unblemished record of 9 wins with no losses, no draws, 2 recorded knockouts to Hannah Terlep, who sports a professional record of 5 wins with 1 loss, 2 knockouts, coming right off a loss. She kind of looks like Peyton Manning. So I suspected that with Katie Taylor vacating the WBA title to remain undisputed champion at super lightweight, this fight might be for the full version of the title. And it is. Stephanie Hahn's best bet to see herself crowned a champion at this weight, because this is still a very competitive division. She stands a better chance of winning this belt than taking Caroline Dubois from her or Beatrice Ferreira's belt from her, or Terry's. Preliminary thoughts: I like Stephanie Hahn to win the fight on February 22nd, the same day as the Better Beef versus Bivol rematch. There's going to be a lot going on in boxing on that day. Bill Goldberg. So Hannah Terlep is coming right off a knockout loss to unbeaten Chelsea Anderson in April of last year. She hasn't rebounded off that loss. Chelsea Anderson's a good fighter. I've been keeping an eye on her. She kind of reminds me of Michaela Mayer, but with more power. And she knocked out Hannah Terlep in April of last year. Fast forward, now Hannah's going to be fighting Stephanie, and I like Stephanie's chances. Stephanie, who had a very productive year last year, hit the ground running. She fought in March, she fought in April, she fought in May, then she fought again in August. 34 years old, she knows time is of the essence. She doesn't have all the time in the world, not as much as some other fighters, younger fighters. So she's trying to get a lot done in a short amount of time, and she's doing it. 4 consecutive bouts in the same calendar year. She'll be sharp the night of the fight. Whereas Hannah hasn't been anywhere near as active the last few years. She didn't box at all in 2023, and she only fought once in 2024, so that's saying that in the last 2 years, she's only fought 1 time, and the 1 time she fought, she lost. I think she's about to lose again. Stephanie's gonna beat her, go on to become WBA champion, and when she does, she will become a person of interest to all the other champions at the weight. All of them. All of which are with major promotional outfits. Caroline Dubois is with Boxer, Beatrice Ferreira and Terry Harper are both with Matchroom. They're gonna come after her. They're gonna want what she's got. And they're not the only ones. Canada's own Jessica Kamara is coming off that lucky dog draw with Caroline Dubois. Fight was scored a draw because it was stopped on cuts before the 4th round, and the rules are any fight that gets stopped before 4 rounds are completed is ruled a technical draw, and thus Jessica is still WBA gold champion, and she's still ranked at number 1 via the WBA's ranked standings, and thus it's conceivable that if Stephanie Hahn becomes full champion, Jessica will be her mandatory. Jessica's very lucky to have walked away with that draw in the Dubois fight, because she was well on her way to getting stopped. Because it was a draw and not a loss, she didn't lose her WBA gold title, and it doesn't look like she lost any ground in the WBA's ranked standings. Thus, she's still in position to challenge for the full title. Somebody else that's going to come after Stephanie if and when she becomes champion. I was skeptical as to whether or not Stephanie Han would see herself crowned a world champion coming back to the sport of boxing so late in life. Could she do it? But she's found a way. I think she's going to pull it off. The caveat is, it only gets harder from there. Only gets harder from there on out. Over to men's boxing, and the proposed plan to put Devin Haney back in the ring with Ryan Garcia. What happens in the mean in-between time? What happens in the interim? Rumor has it, Devin will be facing former unified super lightweight champion Jose Ramirez! Presumably above 140 pounds per Devin Haney's social media account. He said, by 140. I figured as much, that when both Devin and Ryan come back, whoever they fight, it won't be at 140 pounds. They are done there. And apparently so is Jose Ramirez. It's about time. I feel like he stayed in that division too long. I feel like after the Josh Taylor fight, after that loss, he should have moved up. But who would he have fought? He could have fought the same guys that he's been fighting at 140, at 147, because at least then he would have been at a healthier weight. Sporting a professional record of 29 wins with 2 losses, no draws, 18 knockouts, having never been knocked out in 31 professional bouts, I feel like staying at 140 pounds too long manifested in Jose's performances, where at times he just looked flat, like the punches didn't have much steam on them. He was always very big for that weight. 5'10", 72-inch wingspan. Must have been difficult getting down to 140, I think. 32 years old. He'll be at a healthier weight the next time we see him, if we do see him in the ring with Devin Haney. And I don't think enough people are talking about how, stylistically, this is not an easy fight for Devin. The Jaguar. He's a pressure fighter, Jose Ramirez. Did you forget? He's a pressure guy. He's a mid-range to inside volume puncher, and a big one. Having last seen action in November of last year, he fought 2 times last year. Once in April, then again in November. So the night of, he will have seen action in the last 12 months, whereas Devin? It'll be a year out from the shellacking against Ryan. You might have to file this one as a potential banana skin for Devin Haney. In my previous video, we talked about how Ryan's upcoming fight, Ryan's fight with Isaac Cruz, that could be a potential banana skin, but so could this. Devin's not a hard puncher, and stylistically, this ain't the kind of fighter that favors him. This is the kind of guy who's gonna crowd him, who's gonna rush him and push him, let go of a lot of punches. And he's got a chin, Jose. At least more than Devin, and they will both be fighting at what is a healthier weight for them. Turkey's willing to pay these guys a lot of money, but he's not going to match him soft. That's what he's not going to do. And you may be thinking to yourself that Jose is just a faded version of his former self, but maybe that's because the last time you saw him, he was boiling down to 140, not having to make that, not having to lose those extra 7 pounds. You never know. Devin is still an unbeaten fighter, at least on paper, though physically, he still took a beating in his last fight, and psychologically, that's what he's coming from. So you're saying Jose's gonna beat him? I'm saying this is a good fight. I don't look at this as a takeover. Stylistically, this ain't the kind of guy Devin has his way with. He's not an old guy. He's only 32 years old. And he's not a chinny guy. Most would describe Devin as being the chinny one. So it's almost like they have to earn their way back to a rematch with each other that will likely pay out a truckload of cash. But it's not going to be easy getting there. Ryan's got to deal with Isaac. Devin's got to deal with Jose. Could you imagine if one of them lost? Or both. But I guess if they both lost, you could still do the rematch between them if they both lost. It's going to be an interesting run of fights in the coming months, in the calendar year. Just in keeping with the theme of interesting fights in the welterweight division, Ennis versus Stanionis is being finalized for a WBA and IBF welterweight world title unification fight that will take place on April 12th in New Jersey, Atlantic City. So they're bringing big-time boxing back to the East Coast with Ennis. That's what they're doing, because both his fights in Philly drew a nice-sized crowd, and now they're taking him to Atlantic City. What used to be the site of a lot of solid fights, a lot of good fights in previous eras of boxing. Though I am a little bit surprised that this fight isn't happening in Philly. I would have thought that for Boots' first unification match, they would have did it in his hometown. I guess not. Sporting a professional record of 33 wins with no losses, no draws, 29 knockouts. He looks to me to be the noticeably bigger puncher of the two. Between him and Eimantas Stanionis, power would have to go to Boots.
Remember, they both fought Thomas Delorme, and where Jaron Ennis knocked him out in one round, just one round, Thomas Delorme, that same guy, went the distance with Stanionis.
It's not a triangle theory. We're gauging their power. Who hits harder? On that basis, Boots hits harder than Stanionis. Eimantas Stanionis, who has only fought once in the last 2 years. He sat out all of 2023 and only boxed once in 2024. He lost a considerable amount of time on what was supposed to be the Virgil Ortiz fight that never happened. First, it was Stanionis that pulled out. I think he had an appendicitis.
Then it was Virgil Ortiz the last 2 times. He had rhabdomyolysis.
Then it was nothing because the fight didn't happen. Fast forward, he comes back against Gabriel Maestre in May of last year, but that's the only fight that he's had in the last 2.
He finally wised up.
There's nothing for you on the PBC side of things, and there's no money in squatting on that belt. Your best bet to get at a decent-sized bag is to risk it all against Boots, because ain't nobody else trying to unify this division. Boots Ennis, who saw action 2 times last year, once in July, then again in November.
He's looked less than perfect, but still good enough to beat Eimantas Stanionis, I think.
The night of, it will have been roughly 11 months out from Stanionis' last fight in May of last year. Just 1 month shy of a year.
A year of inactivity.
Well, that's the story of Eimantas Stanionis' career. Sparsely active.
Blame his management.
He's a halfway decent, mid-range to inside fighter. Halfway decent. Very aggressive, and what usually works for him will work against him with Boots, because you're gonna get froggy with this guy, and he brought bigger guns to the gun show. He's not Karen Chukadzian. Eimantas Stanionis don't fight nothing like Karen Chukadzian. He's not as light on his feet, he's not as mobile, and he's more aggressive.
So all the stuff that Boots struggled with in the Chukadzian fights, that ain't stuff that Eimantas Stanionis does.
Boots should win. He should knock him out. Finally, in men's heavyweight news, Joe Joyce shuns retirement talk as new fight date is announced. Joe's granite chin met his match when it was cracked by the Chinese power of Zhilei Zhang on 2 occasions in 2023, handing Joyce his first and second career defeats. In the 6th and 3rd round of his 2 showdowns against his fellow fan favorite heavyweight in March of last year, Joyce returned to the ring to take on a seemingly overmatched Cash Ali in Birmingham and needed almost all of 10 scheduled rounds before stopping Ali within seconds remaining on the clock. A small relief in what was ultimately an unconvincing display. 4 months later, Joyce went to battle with domestic veteran Derek Chisoria, but once again, he looked a shadow of his former self, appearing uncharacteristically vulnerable to the attacks of Del Boy, who had not scored a knockout win since 2019. Before the unanimous decision, upset was confirmed and Chisoria's hand was raised.
Let's make a long story short. Joe Joyce has found his level.
A fighter who some heralded as the second coming of George Foreman, not quite. Calls for Joyce's retirement soon followed, but the Putney-based contender has instead opted to remain in the sport. Queensbury Promotions have now confirmed his place on the undercard of Ryan Garner's European title challenge in Bournemouth on March 1st.
So it's not likely that Joe Joyce will see himself crowned a world champion in this era or the next, given that he's in a bad way, his age.
But that doesn't mean he can't still put on a spectacle. That doesn't mean that he can't put on a show against some other fighters that are coming through that, if nothing else, Joe Joyce can be a tough task. A tough task for some of these up-and-comers.
Some other fighters that are out there.
For example, if you told me that Joe Joyce would be facing Dillian White this Saturday,
I'd want to watch it.
If you told me that Joe Joyce would be facing America's own Jared Anderson,
I'd want to watch it.
A David Adelaide after a few fights, after David amasses a bit more experience, or perhaps Fabio Wortley. That there are still interesting fights out there for Joe Joyce. Even if it's not likely that he sees himself become a world champion, he can still be in good fights and he can still make good money. So one guy who's taken a liking to calling out Joe Joyce for a fight is a fighter who is also coming off a loss in Frazier Clarke.
He wants to fight Joe, and Joe, he's open to renewing that amateur rivalry with Frazier.
Joe Joyce said he had not heard of Frazier Clarke calling for a fight between them, but it is one the Juggernaut is open to. Joyce and Clarke are former amateur rivals, with Clarke following Joyce as Britain's super heavyweight Olympic representative. Joyce won the silver in 2016, Clarke took the bronze in 2020. Joyce now, and promoted by Queensberry, is set to return at the Bournemouth International Centre on March 1st. The 39-year-old has won only one of his last 4 fights, having suffered defeats to Zhilei Zhang and Derek Chisora. Clarke, conversely, will likely box in Birmingham in April, having suffered a devastating first-round knockout loss to Fabio Wortley last year. The 33-year-old is 8-1-1 with 6 knockouts. I haven't heard about that. I beat him 4 times in the amateurs, Joyce told Boxing Scene. If that's what people want to see and the money's right, then yeah. Clarke shared Fight of the Year contender with Wardley last March, but the rematch was a blowout as Wardley scored one of the year's most violent knockouts, like Joyce. Wardley is promoted by Queensberry while Clarke is with Boxer. Joyce is also open to a fight with Fabio Wortley. That's obviously an option as well, Joyce added. There's a lot of good options, and I aim to put on entertaining fights. He can still do that. Just because he's coming off of a couple of losses, you don't have to throw the whole heavyweight away.
And with so many of the bigger fights and the bigger names all tight to Saudi and being outsourced to Saudi,
creates an area of opportunity for a fighter like Joe Joyce to garner domestic interest, local interest with local fights. Perhaps not having the name value or momentum in his career at this time to graduate to one of those big Saudi shows, the domestic scene may be where a fighter like Joe services the sport the best. I like the idea of a Joe Joyce versus Frazier Clarke fight.
Now, Frazier's got a little bit more upside because he's younger than Joe.
Never been terribly impressed with Frazier Clarke, and I've seen most of his fights since he went pro. Nothing really jumps out at you about this fighter, though if nothing else, he does have youth and freshness on his side, at least more than Joe, though at the same time, Joe's more battle-tested. He's been in there with Daniel Dubois, Joseph Parker, Derek Chisora, Zhilei Zhang. He's won some fights, he's lost some fights.
At this stage in his career, there's no need for him to be careful, and that makes him dangerous.
But he doesn't have an O to protect, and neither does Frazier Clarke, but Joe's closer to the end, and thus a little bit more desperate to give his career a second wind, a second phase.
I like the idea of this fight, though I don't know how realistic it is. It would be up to Queensberry and Boxer to put this together, and they're not on the best of terms.
Domestically, I think it's a fight that could garner some interest. Domestically, I think it could do fairly well. I mean, it's not Joshua versus Dubois at Wembley or Ben and Eubank, but it is a fight that I think people would show up for. It is a fight I think some would be interested in the UK.
If they made it.
Joe's going to be rebounding off his upset loss to Derek Chisora March 1st against an opponent that has yet to be announced. Needs to use what time remains in his career wisely and hit the ground running this year. Get some semblance of momentum going.
Don't really think Joe Joyce has ever gotten that big bag, that big payday.
Remember that the Daniel Dubois fight, which is arguably his biggest win, was in the bubble. Get it together. One last time, one last hoorah. He can make himself a decent-sized purse.